I'm very happy to announce Maren Richter as our first speaker in this conference. Maren is a curator and art critic and researcher based in Linz in Austria. She was a curator of the European Cultural Capital Linz between 2007 and 2009. She was the director of the Regionale Festival in Austria that took place in 2012 and a co-curator of the Maldives Pavilion at the Venice Biennial in 2013, about which she will, among other things, also talk today. She has co-initiated the collaborative project Grammar of Urgencies and is currently researching on fleeting territories for an exhibition in Valletta in Malta in 2018.
Can someone help me? So this is not part of my presentation, but I couldn't resist because when I arrived yesterday from Malta and I was arriving at the hotel and I opened my hotel room, the TV just starts by itself, you know, and coming with this beautiful image of some aquarium, you know, which is a kind of idealized, almost idealized idea of what the sea is today. Oliver Ressler invited me to talk about a project which I have curated in the year 2013, which was the Maldives Pavilion for the Venice Biennial. At the same time, as Oliver was stressing, I have a few other projects probably which quite relate to the sea, the rising sea level, to the commodification of the sea, of water in general. But very, very recently, I'm obviously again busy with the sea, which is a project taking place in Malta for the European Capital of Culture. And the title of the exhibition, at the same time partly a research, is called The Island is What the Sea Surrounds. And it tries to kind of rethink what Oliver was already stressing, which is the kind of relationship which we have to rethink between land, the commodification of land, and the commodification of water. And the title is actually borrowed from a very early essay of Gilles Deleuze, and I quite like it. It's very simple, actually. It's basically what he says is that we tend to, when we used to, you know, and this has now, I mean, this is exactly what we have to think about, you know, the idea of colonizing space, the idea of colonizing land, and our human attitude towards nature and landscape. So what he's saying in this essay is that our major problem is that wherever we go to, which is some uninhabited land or sea or island, is that we tend to reproduce what we know. And I think this is exactly what we suffer at the moment from, that the narrative of what we are in, the systems, what we are in, is about kind of continuously keeping certain aspects like linear growth of economy, capitalism, and so forth and so on. So this is just to contextualize the title. Hopefully I can speak a bit about the project in the Mediterranean later, but of course one can guess there is a lot of issues like oil drilling, for example, versus refugees, which is quite interesting as well. I mean, there is the secret deal, for example, between Malta and Italy, that and this is again something which is about logistics of bodies versus economy, which is, I think, something which we really substantially suffer from. So this secret deal is that Italy is allowed to drill oil in the maritime territories of Malta, and therefore Italy takes the refugees which arrive or supposed to arrive from Libya to Italy. So this is already, I think, a very small anecdote which tells already quite a lot where we stand right now. But let me go to the project which Oliver asked me to talk about. And this was the first national pavilion of the Maldives. It was also the last, or at least nothing followed. And it happened, but let me maybe go first. Maybe I was a bit wrong. I should have done it differently. So the Maldives, obviously, as we all know, are heavily suffering from rising sea level. It's about 1,200 islands, which are usually very small. There's a lot of issues or reasons. It's not only the rising sea level, but it's also like, how would you call it, the sand grabbing, or the fact that a lot of kind of illegal sand taking for big businesses are taking place. And in the year 2010, I assume, I'm not exactly sure, Maldives had the first democratic elections. Before that it was a dictatorship, and President Nasheed came into power. And one can say, and I think this is nowadays which we need more, but at the same time we luckily also find that, which was a politician, a social democratic, from the Social Democratic Party, who was at the same time also an activist. So he was in a way, doesn't exist anymore. He was in a way very performative in how to address the issues, and this is something I hopefully I can also talk about a bit later, about a project where we think about the term how to perform knowledge, let's say, and information as well. So he had this, probably a lot of you have seen or heard about it, this really kind of obviously very successful way of addressing by doing a cabinet meeting underwater. And in a way, of course, it went all around the world, and we know image politics is quite working well. So this was the starting point for an artist who had some connections to Maldives to say, or to think or propose to him, if, I mean, he has this kind of performative way of doing politics, it could be really interesting to think about having a Maldives Pavilion in Venice, which is supposed to be quite different, I would say, from what we probably know about pavilions. The idea was originally to do not a necessarily physical pavilion, but rather use it as a platform. See, there's a lot of nations coming there, and why don't we do different kind of formats like summits, bringing people together, use the fact that there is like all different kind of people, even politicians. So that was the original idea. Then something happened, which was elections, and President Nasheed was kind of was not voted anymore because he was not obviously one who spoke the populist language, which is nowadays very important. And the new president, and this is very interesting, had a completely new politics on the idea of climate change, referring to the islands, and he did something which happens also like in the US right now. It's like a completely neglect of climate change and the fact that the water is rising. Because what Nashed did, another kind of, I think, very how to say, the very intense way of telling the story of the nation of the Maldives, is that President Nashed was looking for new land. So the idea was to relocate the Maldives to Australia or wherever they would find land. So I think this is a very interesting and touching way of addressing what actually what it means nowadays to think of climate refugees. And interestingly enough, I think, or as far as I know, there's so far only one accepted climate refugee in the world, in New Zealand. So, so the idea of, or the concept, or the logic of being displaced has never to do, at least so far, with climate change. So. So there were a lot of interesting points of departure for us to think about the Maldives as something which is not just about art, but exactly working on the intersection between art, between politics, and the fact that actually whatever is related to climate change, economy, capitalism is never on a micro level. It always immediately refers to the bigger picture. And this is again also something which we probably very much suffer from, are scales, you know, scales which we don't understand anymore, which are you can call them like hyper objects, like Timothy Morton does, a philosopher. So for us it's very difficult to understand that what we do in our, let's say, private home immediately has an effect on the bigger, on the macro scale. But sorry, because I have this picture and I think it's an interesting thing. It's not yet, it is about the Maldives Pavilion, of course. But after the government has changed and the climate change in this kind of aggressiveness it exists was kind of denied, a completely new idea of the Maldives came up. And the thing is unfortunately, that was not necessarily part of what we reflected to, but there was a project. So what you see here is the so-called Island of Hope. So this island is a completely artificial island. So this is the response or the solution of the new government, and this is of course nothing unique. That happens a lot. And also in Venice, the rising sea level in Venice, as you know, is also actually a big issue. And what they do is not finding kind of long-term solutions, but building kind of a wall, you know, which prevents Venice from the rising sea level, so to speak. Yeah, we are already in the project. So what we did, besides the fact that we had to change our concept a bit, and this was very interesting, that's why I'm talking about it, because it shows again, and this is also one of the major problems I think we have to face, is that climate change always comes somewhere, I don't know, like as a topic, as let's say a political topic, always far behind. So whenever something happens which seems to be more important, climate change disappears as well. This is at least my observation. And so we had this situation that our president, who invited us to curate the project, was not existing anymore. At the same time, we had to face a new government which neglects climate change. So we had this big discussion, shall we continue or should we kind of pull out? And there were two camps, and it's really, I tell you that, I mean, it's like talking of behind the scenes, but this is the thing, it mirrors quite what a situation like that is. So there were two camps in the curatorial team. We were 5 people. And the one said, sorry, we have to kind of completely pull out because this is even part of the ministers were those who were in the dictatorship. So we kind of get in a political situation where we have to face that we are pro system, which is neglecting, for example, climate change, but not only, there's human rights issues and so forth, and so on and so forth. And then there was the other camp. I was part of saying, no, let's do it, because this is exactly what happens, you know. There is, all of a sudden something comes up, and then we decide, no, we forget about it and we do something else, or, you know, let's not talk about it now. So we split as well. I mean, it was a really traumatic situation because the one curators couldn't deal with those people. And we had then also another scenario. We couldn't do what we actually wanted to do, this kind of summit more, you know, creating space for negotiations, for meeting, for exchanging, because simply, it's also bizarre, but this was beyond our budget. We didn't take a budget, of course, from this government, so we had to kind of being creative and looking for different fundings, which we did from all different kind of funding, national fundings, and so on and so forth. So we, in the end, had an exhibition which was international. It was not only with artists from the Maldives, because again, what we wanted to say was, we can talk about the Maldives, but at the same time, we always have to talk about the bigger picture. So the projects I invited, one of them was Oliver Ressler, for example, and Klaus Staffler. I'm working on a project with like a longer-term project, and we tried to kind of think of all these different elements which may be kind of talked about when we talk about climate change or the Maldives. At the same time, as I was saying, and as you all know, Venice, of course, is a perfect place to talk about rising sea level, because it's the same problem, so to speak. So this project, I'm not talking so much about the projects, obviously, but more like all these issues which arise. But this project by Klaus Schaffler is actually exactly referring to what I was just saying, this kind of scientific attitude of, or also political attitude, that we are still able technologically to kind of protect ourselves from everything which comes up, like environmental catastrophes, crises, whatever. So we are still able to handle it. And one of the arguments of another project I'm curating is that we are actually not. We are in a big transformation, obviously, and we have to acknowledge that and rather think what kind of productive forces we can create, what kind of tools, what kind of languages we can create in order to acknowledge we are in this transition. Otherwise, we just reproduce what we know, and then we are into this title, the island is what the sea surrounds. This one is a project, again, by Austrian artists. Basically, I invited more or less Austrian artists, also because we got the funding from the Austrian government, mostly, but also because there is a lot of interesting works here. So this was a work done by Heidrun Holzfeind and Christoph Träger. which deals with an aspect of the Maldives, but they did it in various countries, of what has happened after the tsunami. And we know a bit about that from Thailand. I think it was kind of quite interesting, and this is referring a bit to this phenomenon of land grabbing, which Oliver was talking about, is that after the flood, for corporates, for big businesses, it was a welcoming occasion to transform, especially the lands right at the shore, from originally fisher villages, from being very local space and very local economies like small farming and stuff like that, into these big businesses, specifically of course hotels, all these large-scale hotels. And the same has happened in the Maldives, actually. Obviously, the tsunami didn't touch Maldives so much, but and that's also interesting again, and I think this is what Oliver was mentioning. Basically, those who kind of in the end really lose are those who don't have enough money to protect themselves or to kind of even leave. This is usually the most problematic thing also about the idea or the concept of climate refugees, because a lot of people cannot afford that. So this project was observing for quite a while the change of landscape and architecture, from small villages into basically hotels, and at the same time they were looking at the new settlements they were building, which were of course not at the sea anymore, but somewhere in the middle of wherever. So the whole economy, but also the whole culture, and then at the Maldives, like a lot of the language is referring to the sea, is very related to the sea. So a lot of villages ended being relocated somewhere in the inlands in Maldives, but being not at the sea anymore. So there's the economical survival was kind of in danger, or is in danger, and this is what this work was kind of talking about. And there were really interestingly small things, the way how they would set up a kitchen. I mean, there was like these containers, and it completely were different types of kitchens, so that everything was very traditional and very local. So this project is insofar really interesting, is because it focuses a lot on these small details of what it affects if you get relocated, if you have to live in another kitchen, for example. And then we have a work by Oliver Ressler, and this kind of tried to get a bit into so to speak, in the aspect of activism, which we probably hear today with Liberate Tate. A lot is like this new, even almost like a new form of activism, and alliances are happening. So Oliver Ressler has a lot of works which kind of look at the structures and the, let's say, the organizational forms of how protests are organized, how organizational structures exist. And this was is a work which was in a so-called climate camp. Sorry, I forgot where it was. Yeah, exactly. So climate camps, I'm not even sure if they still exist, to be honest, but they do, yeah. So climate camps are formats where people would gather in a place or close to a place which is either referring to a certain kind of land grabbing, and they would kind of stay together for a few weeks, not for a few weeks, but for quite a while, and share and discuss and negotiate, and not always, but most of the time also protest and referring to the local situation. So, sorry, put it wrong. Again, as Oliver was saying, water and oil, they're heavily linked now. We are doing this research right now in the Mediterranean, and I was kind of giving this small example. But also in Malta, for example, what is really interesting, basically there is no water existing. So that's why they are actually so cautious about, or so why they still think that the sea is something very valuable, because the only water they get in Malta, I'm not talking about the Maldives, is from the seawater. So they extract, or they produce drinking water, tap water, only from seawater. And I think this is the reason why they are not drilling oil close to the island. But otherwise, it's, as you can imagine, a very, very contested field. A lot of companies who are doing a lot of researchers at the moment how to go deep as possible in order to get to the oil. So this is a work, or is obviously just one image of a work by Ursula Biemann, and she works a lot exactly on this kind of link between water and carbon geology. And I don't know, how much time do I still have?
Almost done.
Oh, okay. I was too slow, sorry. I tried to implement recent research at the same time. Maybe it was a bit too anecdotal. Okay, now I have to make a point, I guess, which is difficult in the middle of that. But let me do it that way. I think there will be a last part, right? Around 8, where we can make our last remarks, right? So I finish now, obviously in the middle of something, and would give you kind of a sharp remark in the end of the 4 hours. Thank you.
Thank you, Maren. So I think the island of hope you presented or showed us the slide seems like a perfect example for adaptation by necessity instead of a planned transformation by design, which I would prefer. But I think when the negotiations under the framework of the United Nations will continue to be as unsuccessful as they used to be in the past 22 years, then this will probably be the only solution to create architectures of survival for different communities, and to encapsulate themselves from rising sea levels and whatever. But let's hope this will not be our future, and let's hope there will be some ways out, and that our social movements will become stronger and stronger, and will manage to shift the pressure and the power relationships. So are there any questions for Maren? There's still some minutes for questions. Yeah.
Could you briefly explain that last project to us? What the aim of the? Could you briefly explain that last project to us? What was the aim of the artist in the carbon
Basically, what I was saying in between is like the linkage, you know, of the carbon fields in Canada. Sorry, it was in Canada, which was basically, and then she had this other part which was showing the situation in Bangladesh. So there was this kind of linkage between kind of two parts of the world, but which are highly connected.
Yeah.
I would like to know you a little more. You mentioned that there is a first climate refugee officially acknowledged, or officially somewhere, sort of like as such. Could you just elaborate a little bit on this one?
I don't know the full details, but I think it was a few. 3-4 years ago, that New Zealand acknowledged the first climate refugee, and I think he was even from Bangladesh. But what was the actual interesting thing, or why I read about it? That's the interesting part, I guess, is that he at some point was questioned, you know, and this is interesting because it's not tangible. I mean, you know, again, at the moment we kind of have a hierarchy of displacement, and this first is war. So he was criticized and at some point even in danger, saying, well, you know, I mean, you could have made something better out of your life, kind of. So it's still, it does exist, but it's still not acknowledged, or it's very fragile, I would say.
Yeah, as far as I know, the United Nations still has not recognized the term climate refugee.
Yeah.
Because that, of course, would have tremendous consequences.
Yeah.
Just filling in about the climate camps. There was one, in fact, last week. Can you hear me? Yeah?
About climate?
Did you arrive with in the airport?
When?
Did you arrive in the airport?
Yeah, yesterday, yeah.
Yeah, 5 days ago there was a climate camp for about 6 days next to the airport.
Oh, wow, okay.
Trying to not have a third runway in the airport, actually. So these things are going on strongly in Austria.
Wow, no, I didn't know. Did you know?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I was I'm feeling a bit embarrassed because I was obviously away for. I'm in Malta at the moment. Okay. Yeah, sure. Thanks.
I have the feeling that the movement, the climate movement, at the moment is as strong as it has never been the case.
Yeah.
And a part of this movement just forms through these climate camps. So there have been these Ende Gelände camps, for example, in Germany against open coal pits, and I think they were highly successful. And in the last year there was a mass action of civil disobedience in the Lausitz in Germany. We were 4,000 activists participated and blocked the open coal mine and the burning of coal for 48 hours. So I think these are very exciting and very inspiring things that happen in the here and now.
No, I agree. I mean, just a small remark. This happens in Malta, for example, at the moment as well, and this is really interesting. Malta is a very young nation, and civil disobedience or protests didn't actually take place until recently, and basically they are in order to kind of heavily protest against commodification of land and water, and I mean the climate change situation. So yeah, it's true.
So thanks, Maren.